I received these MoFi SourcePoint 8 speakers directly from the manufacturer for review. Was not paid to review them, and I'm not getting any kickback from them. However, if after watching this review you find yourself tempted to buy these, I do have a Crutchfield affiliate link, or you can just Google them and buy them from wherever. If you use my affiliate link, that helps out. I appreciate it. The MoFi SourcePoint 8, in my opinion, better than the 10. The reason why is actually really simple. To me, the 10 is a bit too bright. The top end is elevated, and if you saw my review of the 10 a few months back, you saw that that was really my only complaint that I had about the particular speaker. The 8 compared to the 10, however, is not quite as low frequency capable, which, you would imagine. But I didn't find myself really feeling like the 10 was by far and away better than the 8 in terms of low frequency output and in terms of low frequency dynamics. And the trade-off that you get with the 8 being a truly much more neutral speaker is well worth it for me. Because for the 10, I still would have needed to use a subwoofer to go down as low as 30 hertz for most of my music and even lower. The 8, I would say, gets you to about the mid-40s in room. And I think for most people, that's probably going to be adequate for the majority of music. I don't really like the term musical speaker. I feel like it's often used very liberally, but in this particular case, let's say that this speaker is musical. Realistically, what I mean by that is I feel like it's very true to the source material. And in that way, sure, it's musical. In some cases, if you're listening to music that maybe is very compressed or maybe very distorted, that's what you're going to hear from these speakers. They're not forgiving in that way. But if you listen to well-recorded music, you'll be really happy with the output and the linearity of these speakers. You can aim these directly on axis. You can aim these off axis. Now, concentric designs such as this, where you have the tweeter embedded inside the mid-range, and the mid-range is essentially the waveguide for that tweeter, do best, generally speaking, when they are towed out away from the listening position or cross-firing inward, more inward toward the listening position, anywhere from about 10 to 20 degrees, and does depend on the design. If you aim the speakers directly at you, often what you'll find is there's going to be a diffraction element that causes a dip, potentially even peaking going on after that, usually around 8 kilohertz, 10 kilohertz. Now, how audible is that? It varies. I recently reviewed the KEF LS60, had a diffraction dip of about 4 to 5 decibels, right around 9 to 10 kilohertz. That dip, while I won't say it was obtrusive, I felt like certain tracks were missing some shimmer and some sparkle from cymbals and shakers and things of that nature. A speaker like this will benefit from being towed out off axis a little bit. Do you need to cross them inwards and fire them coming across your face? You can. I wouldn't advise that. What I would advise is to fire them left speaker over your left shoulder, right speaker over your right shoulder. Flip-flop that because I'm in reverse for you. That would mean that you tow them out. Now there's this discussion, toe in versus toe out. Okay. On axis is pointed directly at you. That's how it is. That's the definition. Off axis is any angle away from the listener. Toe out, in my terms, is pointing the speaker more out into the room. 30 degrees would mean that the speaker is basically lined up with the wall behind it. I would not advise that in this case, because when you do that, to me, the high frequency drops off a little bit too much. The instruments that you expect to have some zip and some zow and some zabam and all those kind of fancy buzzwords might suffer from that. Do you lose detail? Now, detail is often analogous in the reviewer space to high frequency bumps. Detailed often, in my experience, it's bright. And so when I read reviews, one of the things that I look for is, are they saying the speaker's detailed? Because if they are, then it's probably going to be bright, and that's what I can expect. Now, having said that, I would not say that this speaker is detailed, but I don't consider that a fault. I consider that a perk, a bonus. I would say, again, that the speaker does a very good job of remaining neutral, not getting in the way of the music, letting you hear what is on the source media. If the source media has itself an elevated treble, that's what you're going to hear. If it does not, well, that's what you're going to hear. That's what I like, and in my opinion, that's what a good speaker should do. It should just get out of the way. I found that by towing the speakers outward about 10 to 20 degrees in that ballpark, and personally I landed on about 10, that what you do is you increase the stereo width a little bit, you don't sacrifice imaging precision too much, and then you still get good linear response in the seated position. I also played around with positioning of the speaker. I initially started it close to the wall. Now this does have 2 rear ports, so you don't want to put it too close to a wall. Doing that lifted the lower bass up a little bit more than what it would have done if I pushed them out from the wall. So then I did that. I moved them out from the wall. I wound up settling on about 2 feet distance from the rear wall, towed out by about 10 degrees, 15 degrees or so, just kind of played around with that a little bit. And that really worked the best for me in my room. I think that in general, that might be the best way to go about positioning the speaker, but as always, you're going to want to do that on your own. And the data can certainly help us get an idea of what the speaker's performance is going to be better suited for, but you'll always want to play around with that in your own room. Stereo effects such as width, height, and depth are always going to be dependent on your positioning between the speakers. If you sit off to the side of the perfectly centered point between the 2 speakers, or you have a very asymmetrical room where it's altering the frequency response a lot, then it's going to be very, very hard for you to get good, precise imaging. When listening to Michael Jackson's PYT, Pretty Young Thing, there's a shaker that's on the left. And as that shaker was going, what I noticed was that it was out in front of the speaker, whereas the vocals weren't necessarily right between the speakers, but slightly recessed behind the speakers. Now, stage depth is also a factor, just like everything I talk about, of the music source itself. If the track itself doesn't have some sort of depth baked into it, you're really not going to get a lot of extra depth out of it. Aside from that, though, positioning really matters. If, just as an experiment, you take your speakers, you move them 6 feet off that rear wall, more than likely, you're going to notice that the stage depth increases drastically. If you put them right near the wall, more than likely, the stage depth just probably isn't going to be there. Now, with these speakers positioned about 2 feet from the rear wall, I noticed that the stage depth was really quite nice. And again, going back to the example of the shaker versus the vocal was behind the speaker, and the shaker wasn't right in front of the speaker. It was well out in front of the speaker by a couple feet. And I thought that was a really neat illusion or a trick due to the stereo imaging effect. Listening to Beat It by Michael Jackson, I was on a Michael Jackson kick that day. There is a bomb, and I made a community post about this, and I asked people where you hear it. I call it a bomb. I don't really know how else to describe it, but it goes beep, and it's about 34 seconds or so into the track, or at least the music video. That sound, for lack of a better word, should pan left to right, and it should sound like it stays up pretty high on the left and starts dragging down a little bit as it goes to the right. Some speakers, when they don't image that well, they have a hard time, especially multi-way speakers with poor crossover elements, or I should say poor crossover design. What will happen is that sound may start off kind of high and on the left, and it may wobble a little bit as it's drifting down and to the right. And on the right, it may end where it's supposed to, but in between the speakers, there's more variability that really shouldn't be there. So it should be a smooth, continuous path, but in those cases, it may wobble a little bit. Well, with these speakers, I didn't have that wobble effect, and that's a good thing. It stayed on that smooth, continuous path. That's another check for imaging that I like to do. And in that regard, these speakers image very well. Now, they're not super duper wide in soundstage, and I would say maybe about plus or minus 50. We'll have to check the data in a second to see. But they're wide enough for me to be content. Do I like a speaker that has a wider soundstage? Generally, yes. But I think these are probably pretty close to what I would be happy with. And again, when you're talking about the other aspects of it having good neutrality and not being super critical as far as positioning and aiming go, I mean, you can go 10 degrees one way or the other, and it sounds pretty dang good no matter what. And you can actually stand above and below the speaker's tweeter line, and it also still sounds really good. So you don't have to be super critical. And when you factor all those things in, even though it may not have the widest of sound stages, and even though it may not go super duper low, it checks off the majority of the boxes. I would say, if we're giving up numbers here, 8 out of 10 for pretty much everything that I like. I mean, If I'm talking linearity, I'd say 9 out of 10, just because to me, it's really ideal. And then the imaging factors and then the soundstage depth to me are also very predominant factors. I'm not too worried about the low bass because, again, I would use a subwoofer. While I show you a video of the speakers, I'm going to read off some of the manufacturer's specs. The pair of speakers is currently retailed for about $27.50. Each speaker features an 8-inch twin drive concentric driver, which also includes a 1 1/4 inch soft dome tweeter. The baffle is said to be designed this way in order to reduce diffraction for a more precise sound. Spec frequency response is 47 Hz to 30,000 Hz. Sensitivity is spec'd at 87 decibels. Impedance is spec'd at 8 ohms. And these do come in a few different color varieties if you want to check it out online. Personally, I actually really like the look of this speaker. For some reason, this speaker it does it for me. It checks the box for a very unique looking speaker. And I like that it has a concentric design around a rather large dome tweeter. I say that also from the experience of playing around and listening to Kef, Genelec, Tannoy, BMS is a pro audio company, B&C, 18 Sound, Radiance, all sorts of pro audio coaxial units. Just aesthetically speaking, this is my personal opinion, I like the look of this speaker more than any of the other coaxial speakers that I've personally laid hands on. Now, let's talk about some of the data and see how some of this might relate to what I found in my Anechoic data. Now, the data you're about to see is captured using the Clipple near-field scanner. It is a very expensive device that allows you to get anechoic data in a non-anechoic room, such as my garage, which you see in this video. To start things off, we're going to look at the impedance. Minimum impedance is actually 8 ohms, so the spec is dead on. Most amplifiers should really not have a lot of trouble driving the speaker. I hooked this up to a cheap Denon AVR, no issues. Powered with the Macintosh MC462, of course, no issues. That amp is ridiculous. This is the on-axis frequency response. Remember, I talked earlier about on-axis means the speaker is pointed directly at you. The tweeter is hitting your face. It's just hitting you right in the face. It's not hitting over here. It's not hitting your other ear or your other shoulder. It's hitting right in the face. That is on-axis. Ideally, the speaker is not pointed on-axis because what happens is you get diffraction elements going on. There's 4 kilohertz and a 7 kilohertz, and you've got some other oddities that are kind of going on. I want to point out real fast, the average sensitivity that I calculated is 86.3, F3 at 52, and the F10 at 43 Hertz. What happens when you turn the speaker 15 degrees off axis? This is the result. Now, if I go back 4 kilohertz, remember how deep that was? And 7 kilohertz, how deep that was? You don't really have that. They're not nearly as deep anymore. There is a notch there, but it's not nearly as deep. This is the CEA data at 0 degrees on axis. And then this is 15 degrees, plus or minus 15 degrees horizontal. And the thing that we're really going to just want to pay attention to here is the directivity. The early reflections directivity and then the sound power. Both of these look really quite good. The sound power looks really good even at 0 degrees. And if I go to 15 degrees, sound power looks still really good. You'll notice it increases a lot here. Well, that's because the tweeter is becoming more directional. This is the estimated in-room response at 0, 15, and 30 degrees off axis. And what I want to note, I'm noting right here, LF roll off around 50 Hertz. Just heads up, that's what you can expect in the room. But also very good directivity makes the speaker more versatile for aiming. Horizontal contour plot actually looks a little bit wider than I expected it would be. Now, the reason I say that is because most coaxial designs are going to be about plus or minus 40, 50, 60, and I just kind of thought this one might be plus or minus 50. It sounded reasonably wide in my room. It didn't sound super duper wide, but 60 degrees that makes sense to me based on what I heard. That makes sense. And that actually is closer to right up my alley for what I preferably like, subjectively like. If we look at the vertical, it's a little bit different and it should really be the same, but the speaker itself isn't perfectly symmetrical. It's not a square, it's a rectangle. Harmonic distortion at 86 decibels and then at 96 decibels. Now you'll note at 96 decibels, it really jumps up above my 3% THD line, which is negative 30 decibels down. That does seem a little bit high, yes, but keep in mind that it's second order. So how likely is that going to be an audible phenomenon? I would say it's going to be much less likely than it would be if it were third or fourth or fifth. I didn't hear any issues in terms of harmonic distortion, at least in the way that I could point to and say, that's harmonic distortion. On the flip side, though, multitone distortion sounds more like music, but it's pink noise. But in my experience, above about 3%, which I've highlighted with this black line, that's where it's going to become more audible. It's not an all or none thing, but as it increases further above that 3% line, it becomes more and more audible. But because it's on the lower end, I think it's going to be less audible than it would be, I should say, if it were up here. So overall, at 96 decibels, I'd say that this distortion may not be great, but it's perfectly acceptable. And I really don't think anybody's going to have any particular issues with that. This data is provided at 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, which means that woofer is moving. What happens if I restrict that woofer's movement to only 80 hertz and above? That's what we've got here. And what you'll notice is that lower mid-range distortion has decreased. In particular, I find it interesting that this particular area kind of stays roughly up, if you will, while this drops down compared to this one again. I retested this a couple different times and I got the same result, I think 3 different times. So the results stay. I just find it interesting. A speaker engineer, a drive unit engineer can explain to me maybe what would be causing this particular area. Maybe it's the suspension distortion. Maybe that's the only thing that I can particularly think of. I find it interesting. Nevertheless, the distortion does decrease slightly if you put a crossover on the speaker. Now that may bring to you the question or the thought of, hey, Erin, I've heard about how you can have modulation distortion, modulating of the high frequency signal by the cone moving. I've been talking about that for over a decade, and I've heard that from other people way before then. So I thought, well, maybe I can try to test that out. So what I did was I just laid over the original signal, 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz at 96 decibels at 1 meter in blue. And then I laid over the green, which is 80 hertz to 20 kilohertz. With that in mind, what you would think is if there is a lot of modulation of the high frequency signal, distortion to the high frequency signal from the woofer moving a lot, then if you cut the woofer off above 80 hertz and let it play only above that, then the high frequency distortion should change pretty significantly if that's the hypothesis. And in this case, the high frequency distortion, you know, I can see a couple little places here where it jumps around and things like that, but the overall trend doesn't suggest to me that there's significant or maybe even menial modulation distortion of the high frequency signal due to the woofer playing with pretty good excursion. Again, this is 96 decibels at 1 meter. That's pretty dang loud. I can't say that that's going to calm everybody's concerns about modulation distortion, but I think this is one particular area where you can go and look and say, objectively, it doesn't look like it's a real problem, at least at this output level. Another area where this speaker shines, at least in my opinion, is compression linearity. Now, when you're talking about dynamic range of a speaker, this, in my opinion, is probably one of the better ways to prove that out. And in the case of this particular speaker, its dynamic range looks pretty good. I mean, the only issue that I'm really seeing is below about 60 hertz, even at this 102 decibels at 1 meter, which is equivalent to 3 meters away, 102 decibels for a pair of speakers in a room. So that's 26 decibels of dynamic range that this speaker has. And frankly, I'm surprised. Just preconceived notions, I would have thought that maybe this speaker wouldn't have had as good dynamic range. But when I was listening, I didn't really hear any problems, and the data doesn't indicate that there's really any issues until you go on the low end. And if you're listening at really ridiculous output levels, you're probably going to want to use a subwoofer around 50 hertz, maybe 60 hertz to make sure that this speaker doesn't creep too far down into the nonlinear range, just as a suggestion. When I opened this video up, I briefly mentioned a comparison between this SourcePoint 8 and the SourcePoint 10 that I previously measured. And I said that the SourcePoint 10 was a brighter speaker. And frankly, when I first fired the speaker up, that's kind of what I expected. I expected that they would have the same voicing. Now, lo and behold, they do not, which I'll also find interesting because this goes into the subjective realm. If you go on the forums, and I've been part of these threads, people will say that they like the 8 more than the 10 or the 10 more than the 8. And in my head, I'm thinking, why? I mean, it should be the same speaker. As far as I knew, it would have been the same speaker. And I'm sure many, many other people thought the same thing. So then I was curious, like, these people just hearing things or what? Well, I got these in, listened to them, and I thought, well, they sound like really linear, even though I truly expected, I mean, because this is sighted listening. I expected that it was going to sound like a brighter speaker, and it wasn't. And then I look at the data and I'm like, oh, well, that makes perfect sense. Why? The mid-range area, roughly the same in level. The high frequency area, you've got anywhere from 4 to 5 decibel gap in the high frequency area. The low end, yeah, you got about 5 decibels at 30 hertz, but going up to that, the tuning of this box is a little bit different. So the slope of the two different speaker enclosures is going to be rolled off a little bit differently. So there's not a huge difference in the low frequency. And that's what I mentioned earlier. And that's really what the data is kind of backing up. Now, if we go and look at the estimated in-room response, which is another good predictor of what the speaker is going to sound like tonally in the room, well, we can see that the SourcePoint 8 in black is about 4 to 5 decibels lower than the SourcePoint 10 in blue. Therefore, it objectively makes sense that people may prefer one of these speaker designs over the other. They do not have the same tonal characteristics. They just don't. On the low end, the 10 gets a little bit lower, but it's not, to me, it's not night and day, at least based off of oral memory. But on the high end, that's where the real difference is. So if you like a speaker that is a little bit brighter, maybe for some reason, then the 10 would probably be the best choice for you. But if you're like me and you like a speaker that is neutral and stays true to the source as best as it can, then the 8, in my opinion, is the better speaker for that. And that does it for this review. I want to thank the folks at MoFi for sending this pair out to me to review. When companies do that, they don't know what to get. I mean, if I didn't like the speaker, that'd have been it. I'd have just said, I don't like the speaker. And that kind of leaves a little bit of a black eye on them. So I appreciate when manufacturers are willing to loan me product and they don't get any say. They send it to me. I don't even think I told them that I received it yet. I just review it. I do my thing. And then I tell them, hey, I reviewed it and I'm ready to send it back. So again, I just want to thank the folks at MoFi, especially John, for loaning the speaker out to me. That was really cool of them. And I know that you all benefit from that data as well. I hope that maybe this comparison of the 10 versus the 8 helps you make sense of what you heard, maybe why you liked one or you didn't like the other over another one. Maybe what makes sense for you to consider purchasing. And again, cheap plug, if you're going to purchase anything, please consider using my affiliate links in the description below. It helps me out and it doesn't cost you anything extra. Alternatively, if you'd like to join me at patreon.com to support what I'm doing here, if you appreciate that, that would be great as well. And I will end the review there. I will talk to you all later. Take care. Peace.